All right, here we go. Chapter 3, Section 1 continued. So we were talking about the area between the Tigris and Euphrates River in the land called Mesopotamia, which present day is Iraq. And the first civilization that appeared there were the Sumerians with their great city of Ur. So each city, each city was a state in itself. Okay, so each city had their own god, each city had their own government. They're actually referred to as a city state. So a city state would be the city and then all of the farmland around it. And each city would usually have a wall. And what do you think it was made out of? Again, those sun dried bricks, which is what they had access to. During the day, the gates of the city would be open, and then at night they would close the gates. Keep out any robbers, keep out wild animals. You would have this narrow, winding road from the gate to the center of the city. You would see the rich living near the center of the city. You'd have the priests, maybe some of the merchants. They would have these 2-story houses with a wood balcony. The balcony would look over their courtyard where they would have, they would get light for their rooms from the courtyard and have fresh air. There were no windows on the outside wall because they wanted to keep the heat of the sun out and the smell of the streets. They didn't want that in their house. Then behind the rich, the next kind of ring of the city, you would have the middle class houses where you would have the government officials and the shopkeepers. You would have artisans. Artisans were these skilled workers. They would more likely have a 1-story house, again with kind of a courtyard for air and light and things like that. And then as you got farther out from the center, that's where you had that lower class, which would be the farmers living out there, which would be the unskilled workers, which would be the fishermen. People took great pride in their cities, in their city states. City states would go to war with other city states, over boundary lines or proving which one's the strongest. In the center of the city, you would see a ziggurat. Ziggurat meant mountain of God or hill of heaven. And it was kind of a series of square levels, and it would have stairs to the top. It was believed to be the home of the city's chief god. And the only person that could enter the home of the god would be the priest. And then around the ziggurat, you would see artisans setting up shop and selling things, and there'd be schools, goods would be stored there. They would feed the poor there. Any kind of great event might occur somewhere around the ziggurat. And when we talk about the god, you notice I said the main god. You see, because there were many gods in the Sumerian culture. And the forces of nature were believed to be alive. Wind, rain, flood, partly because people couldn't control these. You can't control the wind, you can't control the rain, you can't control flooding. And so since you couldn't control them, they were seen as gods. So in the beginning of the gods of the Sumerians, at first there were only male gods, but then you started to see the appearance of female gods. And then the male gods were here to work hard to please the female gods. And the male gods needed servants to help them. And so they made humans from the mud of the river. And so Sumerians believe the only reason that people were on earth was to please the gods. Because if you had unhappy gods, you're going to have an unhappy life. Your crops will die, destruction, things like that. And the only people that knew the will of the gods were the priests. This meant the priests were very powerful. The gods own the land. Well, the priests would administer the land in that God's name. The priests controlled the schools, what people were learning. The schools were really only for the sons of the rich. If you were poor, you had to work in the fields. You had to learn a trade. So they called them tablet houses. As you can see in the picture there, they're kind of holding tablets in their hand. Off the courtyard, you'd have these tablet houses, and the main purpose was to teach how to write. And they would sit in rows on these brick benches, and they would write on clay tablets with these sharp reeds. And their writing is going to be called cuneiform. And cuneiform is a writing that's made up of hundreds of these wedge-shaped markings. And students had to memorize about 600 different word signs. The reason that writing was developed was people had to keep track of business. Cities had too many people. You couldn't remember all the business dealings you were doing. So they developed a way to keep track of it, which becomes writing. And when you graduate from these schools, you could become a scribe or a writer. Okay. And these scribes were these professional writers, very high social status. They'd work for the temple or in the palace and for the government or the army or a merchant or maybe even their own business. And again, who were the only ones to go to school? Basically rich males. So they were the only ones with this opportunity. Women did have some rights. Women could buy and sell property in ancient Samaria. They could run businesses. They could own and sell slaves. But the head of the household was the husband. And the husband could divorce his wife by simply just saying, "You're not my wife anymore." A husband could sell or rent his wife or children for up to 3 years if they needed extra money. The husband, as head of household, could arrange his children's marriage. The children would support their parents as they got older. You obeyed older family members. Everybody in the family obeyed the God and the priests. As far as kings go, at first, there were priest kings, these religious and government leaders. One of the most famous is going to be a priest king by the name of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh of Uruk. He seems like a god. And with Gilgamesh, the story of Gilgamesh is from around 1700 BC. It's the oldest story in the world. Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu travel the world. Enkidu eventually dies, and it leads Gilgamesh to look for a way to live forever. And what he finds is only gods can live forever. And we will quickly here watch a little summary story in a second. And by the way, in the Gilgamesh story, there's a story of a great flood of the world that's very similar to the story of Noah and the ark in the Bible. Very similar. A lot of ancient civilizations have a story of an ancient flood of the world. So let's take and talk lastly about advisors to the priest kings, because a lot of times they would want some advisors, but during war, one member was to be that military leader, but eventually these leaders stayed in charge. And about 3000 BC, you saw those military leaders replace the priests as a permanent king. And then the kingship becomes hereditary, meaning it's passed down from parent to child.